If you visit the tank graveyards of Siberia today, you will see the skeletons of an empire's ambition. You will see thousands of T-72 tanks, their gun barrels drooping toward the frozen earth, their armor plates rusting in the Arctic wind. You will see rows of armored personnel carriers stretching to the horizon, abandoned like toys discarded by a child who lost interest. You will see the machinery of the world's largest ground army decomposing in silence. In 1985, Western intelligence analysts counted Soviet military power with something approaching terror. They counted 40,000 tanks. They counted 50,000 armored vehicles. They counted 5 million men under arms. They counted an arsenal of nuclear warheads sufficient to destroy human civilization several times over. NATO generals studied maps showing Soviet tank divisions pouring through the Fulda Gap into West Germany. The Pentagon requested billions of dollars to counter the Red Army's overwhelming numerical superiority. But they forgot one critical thing. They forgot that a weapon without fuel is scrap metal. They forgot that a soldier without boots is a liability. They did not realize that the mightiest military machine in history was starving to death in plain sight. This is the story of the greatest military illusion of the 20th century. It is the story of how an army that could field more tanks than the rest of the world combined could not afford to train its crews to use them. It is the story of how a navy that launched nuclear submarines by the dozen could not keep them at sea. It is the story of how the Soviet military-industrial complex consumed so much of the national wealth that it destroyed the nation it was built to defend. This is not a story about battlefield defeat. It is a story about spreadsheets. It is the story of how the silent crisis in the Soviet military budget crippled the most feared armed forces on Earth long before a single shot was fired. To understand how the Soviet military bankrupted itself while appearing invincible, we must examine the peculiar economics of communist defense spending. In 1945, the Red Army stood victorious in Berlin. It had crushed the Wehrmacht, the most formidable military machine Europe had ever produced. 27 million Soviet citizens had died in the struggle. The sacrifice demanded compensation. Stalin believed that only overwhelming military power could prevent another invasion from the West. The Cold War that followed created a permanent state of emergency. The Soviet leadership convinced themselves that the capitalist powers were planning a war of annihilation. Every 5-year plan prioritized heavy industry and military production. The best scientists, the best engineers, the best raw materials flowed into defense. Consumer goods were an afterthought. The Soviet citizen would sacrifice comfort for security. On paper, the results were spectacular. By 1955, the Soviet Union had detonated a hydrogen bomb. By 1957, it had launched Sputnik, demonstrating rocket capabilities that could deliver nuclear warheads to American cities. By 1965, the Soviet military had achieved rough parity with the United States in strategic nuclear forces. The balance of terror was established. But beneath the impressive statistics, a cancer was metastasizing in the budget. The fundamental problem was measurement. In a market economy, military spending is transparent. The Pentagon submits a budget request. Congress debates it. Economists calculate the percentage of GDP devoted to defense. The numbers are imperfect, but they exist. In the Soviet system, military spending was a state secret wrapped in deliberate obfuscation. The official Soviet defense budget was a fiction. It claimed military spending consumed roughly 2% of national income. Western analysts laughed at this figure. The CIA estimated the true number was between 15 and 20%. Some economists believed it exceeded 25%. The Soviets themselves did not know the real figure because the accounting categories were designed to hide it. Military production was scattered across ministries that had nothing to do with defense in their official names. The Ministry of Medium Machine Building produced nuclear weapons. The Ministry of General Machine Building manufactured missiles. The Ministry of the Radio Industry built radar systems. Each ministry had its own budget, its own workforce, its own supply chains. The total cost of Soviet defense was distributed across dozens of line items that appeared to fund civilian activities. This opacity served political purposes. It prevented Soviet citizens from understanding how much of their labor funded the military. It prevented Western analysts from accurately assessing Soviet capabilities. But it also prevented Soviet leaders from making rational decisions about resource allocation. They were flying blind, spending money they could not count on weapons they could not afford. The military-industrial complex became a state within a state. It employed the most skilled workers. It commanded the best factories. It received priority allocation of scarce materials. When a tank plant needed steel, civilian factories waited. When an aircraft factory needed aluminum, the production of consumer goods was cut. The defense sector was a vampire draining the blood of the civilian economy. By the 1970s, the burden had become unsustainable, but no one in the Kremlin had the courage to say so. The Soviet military discovered its own version of the magic trick during the Brezhnev era. The trick was simple: declare victory without fighting the war. General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev understood that the Soviet Union could not match American economic output. The United States produced twice as much as the Soviet Union with half the workforce. American technology was generations ahead. American factories were more efficient. American workers were more productive. In a long economic competition, the Soviets would lose. But Brezhnev believed he could achieve strategic parity through concentration. If the Soviet Union devoted a larger share of its smaller economy to defense, it could match American military power weapon for weapon. The civilian economy would suffer, but the military would be supreme. It was a bet that security was worth more than prosperity. In 1965, the Soviet leadership launched a massive military buildup. They would construct a navy capable of challenging American dominance on the high seas. They would deploy intercontinental ballistic missiles by the thousands. They would maintain the largest ground army in the world while simultaneously building a strategic nuclear arsenal that would make the United States think twice about any confrontation. The spending spree began. Admiral Sergei Gorshkov transformed the Soviet Navy from a coastal defense force into a blue water fleet. Between 1965 and 1985, the Soviets launched over 200 submarines, including dozens of nuclear-powered ballistic missile boats. They built aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and frigates at a pace that alarmed Western naval planners. The Northern Fleet and Pacific Fleet grew into forces capable of projecting power across the globe. The strategic rocket forces received even more resources. The Soviets deployed the SS-18 Satan, an intercontinental ballistic missile so massive it could carry 10 independently targeted nuclear warheads. They built the SS-20 Pioneer, a mobile intermediate-range missile that terrorized NATO's European members. By 1985, the Soviet Union possessed over 10,000 nuclear warheads mounted on delivery systems capable of reaching any target on Earth. The ground forces maintained their traditional superiority: 50,000 tanks, 60,000 armored vehicles, 12,000 artillery pieces, 200 divisions on paper, ready to sweep across the North German plain if war came to Europe. The numbers were staggering, overwhelming, terrifying. Think about the cost of maintaining such forces. Every tank requires fuel, spare parts, ammunition, and trained crews. Every submarine requires a crew of over 100 specialists who must be trained for years. Every nuclear warhead requires maintenance by highly skilled technicians working with dangerous materials. Every soldier requires food, clothing, housing, medical care, and a pension. The money flowed out of the Soviet treasury like water through a broken dam. By the late 1970s, the defense burden was crushing the civilian economy. The Soviet Union was spending an estimated 20 to 25% of its gross national product on the military. The United States, by contrast, spent roughly 6%. The Soviet citizen was working 3 to 4 times as hard for military security as the American citizen. But here is the secret that Western intelligence missed. The money was not buying capability. It was buying the appearance of capability. The Soviet military looked formidable on paper because paper was cheap. Building a tank was expensive. Training a crew to use it effectively was even more expensive. Maintaining the tank in combat-ready condition year after year was the most expensive of all. The Soviets built the tanks but skimped on everything else. Flight hours tell the story. A fighter pilot requires 200 to 300 hours of flight time per year to maintain combat proficiency. American pilots typically flew over 200 hours annually. Soviet pilots averaged 40 to 50 hours. They sat in their aircraft, but they rarely flew them. Fuel was too expensive. Spare parts were too scarce. The risk of accidents was too high because maintenance was too poor. Tank crews faced the same constraints. Soviet tank divisions looked impressive on parade, their vehicles freshly painted, their crews in crisp uniforms. But those tanks rarely fired their guns in training. Ammunition was rationed. Fuel was rationed. Engine hours were carefully tracked because replacement engines were in short supply. A Soviet tank crew might fire 10 rounds per year in training. An American crew fired hundreds. Naval readiness was even worse. Soviet submarines spent most of their time in port because they could not afford to operate at sea. The reactors on nuclear submarines required constant maintenance. The crews required extensive training. But maintenance facilities were inadequate and training budgets were insufficient. Soviet submarine captains joked bitterly that their vessels were designed to be photographed, not sailed. The warning signs multiplied through the early 1980s. Training accidents increased as equipment aged and maintenance declined. Morale collapsed as soldiers realized their weapons were unreliable. Junior officers reported that their units were hollow, impressive on paper but incapable of sustained combat. The reports were suppressed, classified, buried in filing cabinets where no one would read them. The Politburo continued to approve defense budgets based on fantasy projections. They counted divisions that existed only on organizational charts. They measured readiness by counting equipment, not by assessing whether that equipment actually worked. They believed their own propaganda about the invincible Red Army. The system was producing military power the same way it produced consumer goods, badly, wastefully, and in quantities that looked impressive only until you examined the quality. The tipping point arrived in December 1979 in the mountains of Afghanistan. On Christmas Day, Soviet forces crossed the border to support a communist government facing Islamic insurgency. The Politburo expected a quick intervention. Soviet advisors would stabilize the regime. Soviet troops would secure the major cities. Within months, perhaps a year, the situation would be normalized. The cost would be minimal. They were catastrophically wrong. Afghanistan became a bleeding wound that would not close. The Mujahideen, armed first with captured Soviet weapons and later with American Stinger missiles, waged a guerrilla war that negated Soviet advantages in armor and air power. Mountains and deserts swallowed divisions. Ambushes decimated convoys. Helicopters fell from the sky. The financial cost was staggering. Official estimates placed the annual expense at 3 to 4 billion rubles. The true figure was certainly higher, hidden in the same accounting tricks that concealed overall defense spending. But even the official numbers represented resources that the Soviet military could not spare. Helicopters destroyed in Afghanistan were helicopters not available in Europe. Ammunition expended against insurgents was ammunition not stockpiled for NATO. Experienced officers killed in ambushes were officers not leading divisions on the German border. The war consumed the Red Army's seed corn. At the exact same moment, a different crisis was unfolding in the oil markets. The Soviet Union had grown dependent on petroleum exports to fund its military machine. Hard currency from oil sales purchased Western technology that Soviet factories could not produce. It bought grain that Soviet collective farms could not grow. It financed the subsidies that kept Eastern European allies compliant. Oil was the lubricant that kept the entire system functioning. In August 1985, Saudi Arabia abandoned production limits. Global oil prices collapsed from over $30 per barrel to under $10 within 18 months. Soviet hard currency revenues fell by an estimated $20 billion annually. The money that had papered over the military budget crisis simply vanished. The new General Secretary, Mikhail Gorbachev, inherited a catastrophe. Gorbachev understood that the military burden was destroying the country. In speech after speech, he emphasized the need for economic reform, for shifting resources from defense to civilian production, for ending the ruinous competition with the United States. He proposed arms control agreements that would allow both superpowers to reduce their arsenals and their spending. But the military-industrial complex resisted. The generals demanded continued funding for new weapons systems. The Defense Ministry argued that any reduction in forces would invite American aggression. The vast network of factories, design bureaus, and research institutes that depended on military contracts fought to preserve their budgets. Gorbachev faced an impossible choice. Cutting military spending would alienate the power structures that kept the Communist Party in control. Maintaining military spending would bankrupt the civilian economy. There was no path that led to both security and prosperity. In 1987, Gorbachev chose arms control. He signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty with the United States, eliminating an entire class of nuclear weapons. He announced unilateral troop reductions in Eastern Europe. He began withdrawing forces from Afghanistan, finally completing the pullout in February 1989. But the cuts came too late and went too slowly. The civilian economy was already in collapse. The defense establishment consumed resources even as it shrank. And the withdrawal from Eastern Europe triggered a cascade of revolutions that swept away the communist governments the Soviet military had been built to protect. By 1990, the Soviet military faced a crisis that no amount of spending could solve. The country it defended was disintegrating. But the final humiliation was not the loss of territory. It was the revelation that the mighty Soviet military could barely function at all. In August 1991, hardline communists attempted a coup against Gorbachev. They declared a state of emergency. They ordered the military to restore order. They assumed that the armed forces would obey, that the tanks would roll into Moscow as they had rolled into Budapest in 1956 and Prague in 1968. The military refused. Some units remained in their barracks, their officers unwilling to fire on civilians. Others deployed but stopped when confronted by crowds of unarmed protesters. Tank crews who had barely trained in years had no stomach for civil war. Soldiers who had not been paid in months felt no loyalty to the Communist Party. The coup collapsed within 3 days. Boris Yeltsin, standing on a tank in front of the Russian parliament, became the symbol of resistance. The plotters were arrested. Gorbachev returned to Moscow, but the Soviet state had received its death blow. The military that had terrified the world for 4 decades had proven unable to execute a simple operation in its own capital. The hollow force that analysts had suspected finally stood exposed. On December 25, 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. The military that had consumed a quarter of national output for decades inherited chaos. The economic consequences for the armed forces were devastating. The dissolution shattered the defense industrial base. Factories that had supplied the Soviet military were now located in independent countries: Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Georgia. Supply chains that had functioned, however poorly, within a single state were now fragmented across hostile borders. A tank factory in Russia depended on engines from Ukraine and electronics from Belarus. An aircraft plant in Uzbekistan needed components from a dozen former Soviet republics that were now demanding hard currency payment. Procurement collapsed. In 1991, the Soviet military received its last deliveries of new equipment. After that, almost nothing. The Russian defense budget, measured in real terms, fell by over 80% during the 1990s. New tank production dropped from over 2,000 units annually to fewer than a dozen. New aircraft deliveries fell from hundreds to single digits. The military could not afford to replace equipment that was wearing out, much less modernize. Personnel costs became unbearable. The Russian armed forces inherited approximately 2.8 million personnel from the Soviet military. Each soldier required a salary, housing, food, and medical care. But the money did not exist. Military salaries fell months into arrears. Officers moonlighted as taxi drivers and security guards to feed their families. Soldiers sold weapons and equipment on the black market to survive. Readiness collapsed to levels that would have been unimaginable a decade earlier. Training virtually ceased. Fuel allocations fell so low that aircraft sat on runways for months without flying. Ships remained tied to piers because they could not afford to put to sea. Tank divisions existed only on paper, their vehicles cannibalized for spare parts or simply abandoned. The nuclear arsenal, the one capability that Russia could not afford to lose, received priority funding. But even here, the budget crisis took its toll. Maintenance of nuclear facilities fell behind schedule. Security at weapons storage sites deteriorated. Western governments began funding programs to secure Russian nuclear materials, terrified that economic desperation might lead to proliferation. The human cost was measured in suicides and alcoholism. Military officers who had devoted their lives to the Soviet armed forces found themselves impoverished and purposeless. The rate of suicide among Russian military personnel soared. Drug and alcohol abuse became epidemic. Hazing of conscripts, always a problem, intensified into systematic brutality as discipline collapsed. By the mid-1990s, the Russian military bore no resemblance to the force that had intimidated the world. The 40,000 tanks had shrunk to a few thousand operational vehicles. The 5 million men under arms had dwindled to fewer than 1 million, most of them poorly trained conscripts serving minimal terms. The blue water Navy rusted in harbors, unable to afford the fuel for training cruises. The mighty Soviet military had not been defeated in battle. It had been bankrupted by its own budget. The final accounting of the Soviet military budget crisis reveals a profound truth about the relationship between economic and military power. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics built the largest armed forces in human history, and in doing so it destroyed itself. The numbers on paper were always impressive: 50,000 tanks, 10,000 nuclear warheads, 5 million soldiers, but numbers measure quantity, not capability. The Soviets counted weapons the way a miser counts gold coins, mistaking accumulation for wealth. They did not understand that a military is not an inventory. It is a living system that requires constant investment in training, maintenance, and modernization. Think about what this means for understanding military power. Every defense analyst who measured Soviet strength by counting tank divisions was making a fundamental error. The tanks existed, but the crews were untrained, the fuel was unavailable, the spare parts were missing, the logistics chain was broken. The divisions were phantoms, impressive on organizational charts but incapable of sustained combat operations. The story of the Soviet military budget crisis teaches several lessons that remain relevant today. The first lesson is that sustainability matters more than size. The Soviet Union could build weapons faster than any nation on Earth, but it could not afford to operate them. A military that cannot train, cannot maintain its equipment, and cannot pay its soldiers is not a military at all. It is an expensive decoration. The second lesson is that opportunity cost is always paid. Every ruble spent on a tank was a ruble not spent on a consumer good, a factory, a road, or a school. The Soviet leadership believed they could sacrifice prosperity for security. They discovered that without prosperity, there is no security. The civilian economy that they neglected was the foundation on which military power ultimately rested. The third lesson is that secrecy is self-deception. The Soviets hid their military budget from the world and from themselves. The opacity that was meant to confuse enemies actually confused Soviet planners. They could not make rational decisions because they did not have accurate information. They believed their own propaganda about military readiness because the truth was classified. When governments today build militaries they cannot afford to operate, remember the Soviet example. When analysts count weapons without assessing readiness, remember the hollow divisions. When leaders prioritize military spending over economic development, remember that the Soviet Union spent itself into oblivion. Remember that the most dangerous military crisis is the one that happens in silence, in spreadsheets, in budgets that do not balance. The tank graveyards of Siberia today are monuments to a particular kind of failure. They commemorate a system that confused the appearance of power with its reality. The empire that built more tanks than the rest of the world combined could not afford to fuel them. The navy that launched submarines by the dozen could not keep them at sea. The army that terrified NATO for 4 decades proved unable to execute a coup in its own capital. The military that consumed a quarter of national output for generations delivered rust and bankruptcy. This is the lesson of the Soviet military budget crisis. You can count divisions, you can parade equipment, you can intimidate the world with numbers, but you cannot fight with paper strength. Eventually, the fuel runs out. Eventually, the bills come due. I'm John, and this is the Cinematic Historian channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming.